The scorching summer sun beat down on Grace Reed's battered body as she collapsed in front of the imposing wooden gate. 3 days without food and only brackish water from muddy creeks had left her delirious, her once fine traveling dress now torn and filthy from her desperate journey across the unforgiving Texas landscape. The year was 1873, and Grace had lost everything. The stagecoach robbery had taken not just her possessions, but also the life of her elderly uncle, her last living relative, and her reason for traveling west. When the bandits had finished with the other passengers, they dragged her into the scrubland with darker intentions. It had taken every ounce of her courage and wit to escape them in the night. Now, after days of stumbling through unfamiliar territory, her strength had finally given out at the entrance to what appeared to be a cattle ranch. As consciousness faded, she caught a glimpse of a tall figure rushing toward her from the direction of the barn, dust swirling around his boots. Ross Irving had been breaking a new stallion when he spotted the woman collapse outside his gate. He abandoned the horse immediately, vaulting over the corral fence and running toward the motionless figure crumpled in the dirt. He knelt beside her, gently turning her over to reveal a face streaked with dust and dried blood, but still unmistakably beautiful despite its pallor. "Miss. Can you hear me?" Ross touched her cheek, finding her skin alarmingly hot. Without hesitation, he slipped his arms beneath her slight form and lifted her against his chest. The woman stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal eyes the color of summer sage before rolling back as she slipped into unconsciousness again. Ross quickened his pace toward the main house, his mind already racing through what needed to be done. She was clearly in desperate condition, dehydrated, possibly wounded, and suffering from exposure to the brutal Texas heat. As he carried her through the doorway of his modest but well-built ranch house, he whispered, "You're safe now." Though she couldn't hear him, the promise in those words solidified his resolve. Whatever had happened to this woman, whatever had driven her to his doorstep, he would protect her. Ross laid her gently on his own bed, quickly gathering water, clean cloths, and the small supply of medicines he kept on hand. 8 years of ranching alone had taught him basic medical skills necessary when the nearest doctor was a day's ride away in Sweetwater. He dampened a cloth and began to clean the dirt from her face, revealing a scattering of freckles across her nose and cheeks. Her hair, once he removed the pins that barely held it in place, tumbled down in auburn waves. She couldn't be older than 25, he guessed, though the lines of exhaustion made it difficult to tell. When she stirred again, Ross helped her drink small sips of water, supporting her head with his calloused hand. "Where?" Her voice was barely audible. "Irving Ranch, about 40 miles east of Sweetwater," Ross answered, his deep voice gentle. "I'm Ross Irving. You're safe here." "Grace," she managed before coughing. "Grace Reed." "Rest now, Miss Reed. Questions can wait." She nodded weakly before slipping back into sleep. Ross continued his ministrations, discovering bruises on her wrists and a long, shallow cut on her arm that he carefully cleaned and bandaged. The story those injuries told made his jaw clench in anger. Ross spent that night in a chair beside the bed, dozing lightly and waking at her slightest movement. By morning, her fever had broken, and when she opened her eyes, they were clearer, more focused. "Mr. Irving?" Her voice was stronger now. "You remember." He smiled, pouring a fresh cup of water. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been dragged behind a horse." She attempted to sit up, wincing, "But alive, which is more than I expected yesterday." Ross helped her adjust the pillows behind her back. "You had me worried." "Care to tell me what brought you to my gate half dead?" Grace looked down at her bandaged arm, her expression darkening. "Stagecoach robbery, 3 days ago on the road from Austin." Her voice wavered. "They killed my uncle. He was taking me to his ranch near Fort Griffin after my parents died last winter in Boston." "I'm sorry for your loss," Ross said, genuine sympathy in his voice. "The bandits, they hurt you?" Grace's eyes flashed with a mixture of fear and defiance. "They tried. I escaped during the night while they were drinking. I've been running ever since, hiding during the day, traveling at night. I had no idea where I was going." "You did well to survive," Ross said, his admiration evident. "Not many city folk could have made it through 3 days in this country alone. I had motivation." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Living seemed preferable to the alternative." Ross nodded, understanding the courage it must have taken. "You're welcome to stay here until you're recovered. I can send word to Fort Griffin about your uncle once my ranch hand returns from town." "You're very kind, Mr. Irving, but I have nothing to offer in return. The bandits took everything: money, clothes, even my uncle's pocket watch." Her voice caught on the last words. "I'm not asking for payment, Miss Reed. Out here we help those in need. It's the code we live by." He stood, his tall frame casting a shadow across the bed. "Now I've got chores to tend to, but there's stew warming on the stove. Think you can eat something?" Grace nodded gratefully, and Ross brought her a bowl of hearty beef stew. As she ate, she looked around the room, taking in the simple but well-crafted furniture, the books stacked neatly on a side table and the rifle mounted carefully above the door. "You live here alone?" she asked between bites. "Just me and occasionally Jeb, my ranch hand. He rides into town every few weeks for supplies." Ross leaned against the doorframe. "It's not much compared to Boston, I imagine. It's—" Grace searched for the right word: peaceful. After everything, peaceful sounds wonderful. Over the next few days, Grace regained her strength quickly. Ross brought her some clothes that had belonged to his late mother, simple but well-made dresses that were only slightly too large for her frame. By the end of the week, she was insisting on helping with household chores, despite Ross's protests that she should continue resting. "I can't just lie in bed while you work all day," she declared, rolling up the sleeves of her borrowed dress. "Besides, I need to be useful. It helps keep my mind off." She didn't finish, but Ross understood. They fell into an easy rhythm, Ross handling the ranch work while Grace took over the cooking and housekeeping. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the vast Texas sky in magnificent colors. Ross told her about his journey from Tennessee after the war, how he'd worked cattle drives for years before saving enough to buy this small spread. Grace, in turn, shared stories of her life in Boston, of music lessons and literary societies, of the fever that had taken both her parents within a week of each other. Her uncle, her father's brother, had been her only remaining family. "He wanted to show me the wild beauty of Texas," she said one evening, her voice soft with memory. "He wrote that it would heal my heart. I think he was right, just not in the way he imagined." Ross glanced at her profile, gilded by the setting sun. In just 2 weeks, she'd transformed from the half-dead woman at his gate to this poised, resilient person who somehow made his bachelor ranch house feel like a home. Her presence had awakened something in him he'd thought long buried, a longing for companionship, for something more than the solitary existence he'd built. The arrival of Jeb Donnelly from town broke the peaceful routine they'd established. The weathered ranch hand brought supplies, mail, and news, including confirmation that a stagecoach had indeed been robbed on the Austin Road, with 3 passengers killed. "Sheriff's got a posse tracking them bandits," Jeb reported as they unloaded the wagon. "They're thought to be the Carson brothers. Mean bunch. Been terrorizing the territory for months now." Ross saw Grace stiffen at the mention of the bandits, her hands clutching the edge of her apron. Later that night, he found her on the porch, staring into the darkness, her shoulders tense. "We should contact the sheriff," Ross said, joining her. "Your testimony could help bring them to justice." Grace shook her head. "They'd find me. They said they would if I ever told anyone." Her voice trembled slightly. "I've put you in enough danger already by staying here. No one knows you're here except Jeb, and he's loyal as they come." Ross stepped closer, wanting to comfort her but unsure how. "Besides, I can handle myself. Like my uncle thought he could." Grace turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "He was a good shot, a strong man. They killed him without hesitation, Ross. I can't be responsible for your death too." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and something shifted between them in that moment. Without thinking, Ross reached out, his hand gently touching her shoulder. "I'm not asking your permission to protect you, Grace. I'm simply telling you that I will." The next morning, Ross sent Jeb to the sheriff in Sweetwater with a message about Grace's whereabouts and what she'd witnessed, along with a request for discretion. Grace was reluctant, but understood the necessity of involving the law. As spring gave way to early summer, life on the ranch continued. Grace proved herself adept at learning ranch skills, feeding chickens, gave way to helping with calving, and soon she was even joining Ross on short rides to check the property boundaries. Her city-bred reticence faded, replaced by a genuine love for the wide open spaces and the freedom they represented. "I never thought I could feel this way," she confessed one afternoon as they rested their horses atop a small rise overlooking the ranch. "In Boston, everything was so confined, not just the spaces but the expectations. Who I should be, how I should act." "And how do you feel now?" Ross asked, watching the wind play with tendrils of her hair that had escaped her practical braid. "Like I can breathe." She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Like I'm becoming who I was meant to be all along." Ross nodded, understanding completely. It was what had drawn him to this life after years of wandering, the sense of possibility, of building something genuine with his own two hands. Their growing closeness wasn't lost on Jeb, who took to giving Ross knowing looks whenever Grace was mentioned. "She's a keeper, boss," the old ranch hand said one day as they mended fences. "Don't be a fool and let her go back east when this business with the bandits is settled." Ross had no response. The thought of Grace leaving had begun to haunt his quiet moments, but he had no right to ask her to stay. What could he offer a Boston-bred lady accustomed to society and culture? His modest ranch and simple life would seem paltry compared to the opportunities awaiting her back east. The decision might have been postponed indefinitely if not for the letter that arrived in mid-June. The sheriff of Sweetwater had written to inform them that 2 of the Carson brothers had been captured after a shootout near the Red River. The third brother, Elias Carson, had escaped and was believed to be heading south, possibly toward their vicinity. "We should get you to town," Ross said after sharing the news with Grace. "The sheriff can protect you there until they capture the last brother." Grace looked around the ranch house, at the home they'd created together over the past 2 months. "This is where I feel safe," she said quietly. "With you." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Ross stepped closer, his heart racing like it hadn't since he was a young man. "Grace." A shot rang out, splintering the window frame inches from Grace's head. Ross reacted instantly, tackling her to the floor as more gunfire erupted from outside. "Stay down," he commanded, crawling toward the rifle mounted on the wall. A quick glance through the shattered window revealed a lone figure crouched behind the water trough, reloading a rifle. "Elias Carson," Grace whispered, her face pale but composed. "I recognize him." Ross nodded grimly, checking his rifle. "Jeb's in the south pasture, we're on our own." He met her eyes. "Can you shoot?" "My uncle taught me. I'm not expert, but I can hit what I aim at." Ross retrieved his revolver from the drawer beside the bed, handing it to her. "I'm going out the back. If he comes through that door, don't hesitate." Grace took the gun, her hands steady despite the danger. "Be careful, Ross, please." He allowed himself one moment of weakness, brushing his lips against her forehead. "Always am." Moving silently through the house, Ross slipped out the back door and circled around the barn, using the gathering dusk as cover. Carson, focused on the main house, never saw him coming until it was too late. "Drop it," Ross commanded, his rifle trained on the bandit's back. Carson froze, then slowly turned, his weathered face twisting into a sneer. "Well, if it ain't the hero Cowboy. That little filly in there belongs to me and my brothers. We found her first." "That little filly is a lady under my protection," Ross replied, his voice cold. "And you're trespassing on my land." Protection, Carson laughed, a harsh sound. You sweet on her, she's a wildcat, that one. Fought like the devil when we grabbed her. Makes it more fun, though. Ross's finger tightened on the trigger, rage building in his chest at the man's implications. Drop your weapon, Carson's eyes narrowed, calculating his chances. His rifle lay beside him where he'd set it to reload his pistol. In one fluid motion, he went for the handgun at his hip. Ross fired once. The shot echoed across the ranch as Carson collapsed, blood blossoming on his chest. The bandit gasped, struggling to raise his pistol, but Ross kicked it away, keeping his rifle trained on the dying man. You should have stayed north, Ross said quietly. Carson coughed, blood speckling his lips. She ain't worth dying for, he gasped. Ross watched the light fade from the bandit's eyes. Yes, he said to the now still form. She is. Grace appeared in the doorway of the house, Ross's revolver still clutched in her hand. Her eyes went from Ross to Carson's body and back again. Without a word, she crossed the yard to Ross's side. Are you hurt? She asked, her voice remarkably steady. Ross shook his head. He never got a shot off. Grace stared down at the man who had haunted her nightmares for months, her expression unreadable. Then she turned away, her shoulders straightening. I'll put coffee on. Jeb will have heard the shots, and we'll need to send for the sheriff. Ross watched her walk back to the house, marveling at her composure. This was no fragile flower, but a woman of remarkable strength. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't let her go. The aftermath passed in a blur. The sheriff came and went, taking Carson's body and recording their statements. Letters arrived confirming that the remaining Carson brothers had been sentenced to hang for their crimes. Gradually, the shadow that had hung over Grace began to lift. On a warm July evening, exactly 3 months after she had collapsed at his gate, Ross found Grace sitting on the porch swing he had built for her, watching the fireflies rise from the tall grass. I received a letter today, she said as he settled beside her. From my mother's cousin in Philadelphia. She's offered me a home there and entry into society. Ross felt his heart constrict, though he'd been expecting something like this. A woman like Grace had options, connections back east. Their time together had always been borrowed. When will you leave? He asked, struggling to keep his voice neutral. Grace turned to face him, the fading light gilding her features. I wrote back declining her offer. Ross stared at her, afraid to hope. You did. This is my home now, she said simply, if you'll have me. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Ross took her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. Grace Reed, I have loved you since the day you opened your eyes in my bed and thanked me instead of screaming at finding yourself in a stranger's home. The words, so long contained, flowed freely now. You belong here not as my guest or my housekeeper, but as my wife, if you'll do me that honor. Grace's free hand came up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. I was so afraid, she whispered. Afraid that you saw me as just another responsibility, someone to protect. Ross turned his face to press a kiss against her palm. I see you as the strongest woman I've ever known, as the person who turned this house into a home, as the other half of my heart. Grace's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Then yes, Ross Irving, I will marry you. Their first kiss was gentle, a promise exchanged in the gathering dusk. When they parted, both were smiling, the future stretching before them as vast and promising as the Texas sky. They were married 2 weeks later by the traveling preacher who visited the scattered ranches of the region. The ceremony was simple, just the two of them, Jeb, and a few neighboring ranchers who had become friends. Grace wore a new dress she had made herself from fabric Ross had ridden a full day to purchase from Sweetwater. That night, as husband and wife, they discovered each other anew. Ross's reverent touches and whispered endearments healed the last of Grace's fears, replacing memories of violence with tenderness. Grace's eager responses and loving words filled the lonely spaces in Ross's soul that had existed for so long he'd ceased to notice them. The years that followed brought both joys and challenges. Their first child, a son they named William after Grace's father, arrived 10 months after their wedding. A daughter, Sarah, followed 2 years later. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts, Ross's practical knowledge and Grace's head for figures proving an unbeatable combination. 5 years to the day after Grace had fainted in the dust outside Ross's gate, they stood together on the porch of their expanded home, watching their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. You ever think about how differently things might have turned out? Grace asked, leaning into her husband's embrace. If I'd collapsed at someone else's gate, or if you hadn't been home that day, Ross tightened his arm around her waist. I believe we were meant to find each other. I was just fortunate that you fell at my feet rather than making me chase you across Texas. Grace laughed, the sound still his favorite music after all these years. You would have caught me. Every time, he agreed, turning her to face him, and I'd carry you home and tell you you're safe now. I am, Grace whispered against his lips. I always will be with you. As the first stars appeared in the Texas sky, their lips met in a kiss that held the promise of all the years to come, years built on the foundation of that fateful day when a desperate woman found refuge with a solitary cowboy, and both discovered the home they'd been seeking all along. In the distance, their son's laughter rang out as he captured a glowing firefly in his small hands, his sister clapping in delight. The sound drifted across the ranch that had once been just a place of work and was now the heart of a family, a testament to the unexpected ways love could blossom even in the harsh landscape of the Wild West. Ross and Grace Irving watched their children play, their hands clasped together, fingers intertwined like the roots of the oak tree they had planted on their first anniversary, growing stronger with each passing season, weathering whatever storms might come, standing tall against the Texas sky that had witnessed their beginning and would watch over their forever.